Welcome to a new history of Old San Antonio, Episode 9, San Antonio Revolts. I'm Brandon Seal.
Oh, my city, San Antonio. Tonight I'm looking at your lovely life.
On June 4th, 1807, a dust-covered American lieutenant arrived in San Antonio under Spanish military escort. Texas Governor Manuel Cordero went out personally to receive the lieutenant, masking his deep suspicion of the interloper with theatrical displays of hospitality. The clean-shaven, fair-featured man from the East claimed that he had become lost while exploring the borders of the Louisiana Purchase, acquired by the United States from France just 4 years prior. He had wandered into Colorado and then Santa Fe, where he'd been placed under guard and marched down to Chihuahua, where he was politely but firmly reprimanded and returned up the Camino Real to San Antonio en route to New Orleans. The American lieutenant, one Zebulon Pike, was flattered by the governor's attentions and honored by the opportunity to ride in his coach up the Mission Trail and into town. Like so many other visitors to the area, he was enchanted by the country, calling it, quote, one of the richest, most prolific, and best-watered countries in North America, end quote. The missions, he observed, quote, for solidity, accommodation, and even majesty, were surpassed by few buildings he had seen in New Spain, end quote. Yet in truth, the missions were shells of their former selves. By 1793, Valero was home to just 45 converts, San Jose 106, Concepcion 47, San Juan 31, and Espada 41, a quarter or so of the populations that they had supported just a generation earlier. The mission ranches went untended, the fields untilled. The adjustment to mission life had proven difficult for Native Americans. As we've mentioned previously, the birth rate for mission couples was only 1.3 children per pair. Most died before the age of 30. 2/3 of all baptisms recorded in this period were children who died before the age of 3, deathbed last rites that falsely inflated the numbers of converts that the missions continued to report. In truth, there were no more local Indians left to convert. The majority of the natives had been decimated by disease or had moved along to greener pastures. The few that had embraced mission life had assimilated into Spanish society as far as they were going to, and the Franciscans' attempts to shelter them from the corruption of the secular world had counterproductively ensured that full-on assimilation would always be an uphill battle for the converts. It would be General Teodoro de Croix, that royal inspector we followed in Episode 7, who in 1779 first uttered the word secularization, the political term for disbanding the missions and distributing their lands. The missions were, in a technical sense, the property of the crown. The Franciscans merely oversaw them. And the missions had been losing the crown's money for long enough, in the opinion of most royal observers. Specifically, General de Croix ordered the secularization of Mission Valero, whose expansive and underutilized lands had long been coveted by the nearby vecinos of San Antonio. In fine Spanish colonial tradition, however, the mission fathers were able to delay implementation of the order for a solid decade. But by 1792, neither the Franciscans nor Spanish authorities could ignore the mission's decline or civilian San Antonio's pressing need for more lands any longer. One group in particular had been especially vocal about unlocking new lands for settlement, and theirs was a grievance that even the typically aloof Spanish authorities were sympathetic to. When the Marquis de Rubí had ordered the removal of the East Texas missions and civilians to San Antonio in 1772, he hadn't given any thought as to how these East Texas evacuees would actually make a living once they got to San Antonio. In East Texas, most had been farmers and landowners. Now, suddenly, they were made landless refugees at the bottom of the socioeconomic order. For 20 years, they lingered around the edges of San Antonio society, some taking work as day laborers, others taking up new trades, and others still defying royal authorities and moving back to East Texas on their own. The ones who stayed, however, begged the Spanish government for help, and many local San Antonians lent their voices in support of their pleas. When Mission Valero became the first mission to be secularized in 1793, its lands were earmarked for these East Texas families. Finally, after 20 years of patient suffering, these East Texans were incorporated into San Antonio's economic system. Valero's lands were actually so extensive that the 15 remaining mission families were also easily accommodated, with enough left over to reserve a few plots to the town for future growth. Valero's ranch land south of San Antonio, some 20,000 acres, would come into the possession of Erasmo Seguin, grandson of Bartolomé Seguin from the previous episode and a third-generation San Antonian. And the mission itself, which boasted the thickest walls of any of the missions, was quickly taken over by a Compañía Volante, or light cavalry unit, that traced its origins to a small town in Coahuila known as El Alamo, which would soon give its name to the decommissioned mission. In June 1794, Mission Espada was secularized through a similar process, and San Juan followed the next month. Secularization at Concepcion would be nominally delayed until 1823, and at San Jose until 1824, but by then, many of the lands had already been taken over by San Antonio citizens. The old missions continued to define the communities around them. More than little neighborhoods, they were really like separate towns. San Jose still had its own alcalde, or mayor, into the 1800s, in this case, Don Pedro Huizar, that sculptor of the famed rose window, whose descendants still live in the shadow of Mission San Jose. San Juan's converts maintained their blended Native American and Catholic practices, and Espada 50 years later supported an independent community of 37 Indians and 57 Spaniards and mestizos. The mission's secularization set off several mini-migrations within San Antonio as well. When the East Texans moved onto Valero's lands, many of them vacated their homes in the little neighborhood they had settled just south of the Horseshoe Bend of the San Antonio River. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which had brought Lieutenant Pike to San Antonio, Spain offered many of its former citizens in Louisiana financial incentives to move to Texas, and many of these new immigrants, including a self-proclaimed Dutch Baron de Bastrop, moved into this little community on the other side of the river, calling it La Villita, or the Little Town. Spain offered these incentives to their former subjects in Louisiana because they desperately wanted to fill up the vast Texas wilderness as a buffer against their new neighbors to the east. Spain soon realized that the Anglo-Americans were even more menacing than the French, who were content to trade furs and guns. Anglo-Americans, on the other hand, wanted land. Even as Spain had struggled for 100-plus years to populate its North American frontier, in just the 20 years since the Anglo-Americans had won their independence, they had expanded westward 1,500 miles and had just doubled the size of their country again with the Louisiana Purchase, which placed them for the first time in direct proximity to Spanish Texas. The first Anglo-Americans had started to trickle across the border prior to the Louisiana Purchase, yet these were mostly smugglers or rowdies looking for cheap cattle and horses. More troubling to men like Governor Cordero were the so-called filibusters, men who coupled their desire for land with the rhetoric of American liberty. Indeed, for Anglo-Americans of this period, land ownership was inseparable from their conception of individual liberty, and they felt ordained by God to spread their new political gospel to the world. As such, Governor Cordero was careful to control what he showed Lieutenant Zebulon Pike. He needed to impress the lieutenant with Spain's strength, while simultaneously emphasizing the town's foreignness and undesirability as an object of American expansionist ambitions. He paraded the Presidio unit before the American lieutenant in their full field dress and wowed him with displays of San Antonians' skills on horseback. The governor housed him in the Spanish governor's palace for his 10-day stay, hosting dinner parties nightly and charming him with the nightly paseos and fandangos of which San Antonians were so fond. The American lieutenant, for his part, was duly impressed with San Antonians' industry, courtesy, and urbanity, believe it or not, though he noted that San Antonio men lacked in conversational skills, talking of only, quote, women, money, and horses, end quote. Oh, how the times change. Courtesies having been observed, Governor Cordero sent Lieutenant Pike on his way back east, still under military escort, of course. His PR campaign backfired, however, as the town's exoticism clearly captured Lieutenant Pike's heart, something that comes through clearly in his widely published account of his journey. He described San Antonio as, quote, one of the most agreeable places that we met in the province, end quote, and Lieutenant Pike's account of the town would serve to whet the appetite of many Anglos for the exotic land that they referred to as the Texas. There were forces on the other side of the world destabilizing Spain's control over San Antonio as well. In 1808, Napoleon declared war on Spain and invaded, deposing the Spanish king and placing his own brother on the throne. In August of that same year, he sent a French general into Texas from Louisiana with the goal of provoking a revolution against Spain in that province. San Antonio's reputation for political fractiousness and its long proximity to French Louisiana and its Enlightenment ideals made it fertile soil for revolution in the eyes of Napoleon. He had hoped to stir up New Spain's internal political factions and sow the seeds of revolt, so that by opening a front there, he might deny the resources of New Spain to her mother country. Two primary political factions existed in San Antonio in 1808. The most vocal members of the so-called Republican faction were Juan Martín Veramendi, José Antonio Navarro, and José Francisco Ruiz, all three of which were related so heavily by marriage that we might better think of them as a single clan. The Veramendi-Navarro-Ruiz clan was enchanted by the Republican, little r, liberal, little l, ideas coming out of Europe, and particularly the United States at this time, that held out the radical notion that people might actually be able to organize themselves without the need for top-down direction from a monarch or a bureaucratic state, and that really, a government need do little more than enforce the laws, encourage individual initiative, and stay out of the way. The Royalist faction, on the other hand, strongly defended the traditional structures of Spanish society, particularly the crown and the church. Most vocal in the Royalist faction were the Zambrano brothers. José Dario Zambrano and Juan Manuel Zambrano were born to one of the wealthiest families in town. Both were ordained as priests in 1793, though neither would overly concern themselves with strict adherence to their vow of chastity, for which each would be reprimanded in his own time. By 1811, they were both back in San Antonio with cushy postings that afforded them ample time to pursue their wide-ranging business and extracurricular interests as well. In reality, these factions didn't cut neatly down family lines, as was inevitable in a community as small as San Antonio's. José Antonio Navarro's brother, Ángel, was much more conservative and initially loyal to the Spanish crown, even as he married one of his more Republican Ruiz cousins. Along with him were some of the conservative old Canary Island families, like the Arrochas and the Delgados, though again, They harbored Republicans in their midst as well. And Erasmo Seguin, the royalist rancher, stockman, and commander of the local militia, had a rebellious streak himself, as when he led protests against the old cattle tax and a proposed new tax to fund the construction of a jail. Yet the French had misunderstood the factionalism and contentiousness of San Antonio's politics. Even as they warred ideologically, San Antonio's factions were united in their preference for a Spanish government over a French one. Napoleon's agent was captured by loyalists just a few days after he entered Texas, and was marched through the streets of San Antonio under military escort, just as Lieutenant Pike had been the year before, though to a much different fate. Sidebar: on the march to his ultimate execution in New Spain, the French general was held for a time in Dolores, a small town in Guanajuato, where he was ministered to by a priest named Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. More on him later. Despite San Antonio's unified opposition to and detention of the Frenchmen, the very fact that this aborted insurrection had happened in this remote frontier province full of known smugglers and individualistic ranchers actually heightened official Spanish suspicions of San Antonio. More troops were sent to the province, along with a new governor, Manuel Salcedo, under orders to keep a close eye on the locals, a move which San Antonians resented deeply. Back in Spain, a resistance government loyal to the deposed King of Spain formed in Seville, the so-called Central Junta. The Central Junta called a convention of all Spaniards, including representatives from even the most remote provinces on the northern New Spanish frontier. The Spanish viceroy in Mexico City, however, decided that one representative from the relatively central state of Durango would be enough for all of the so-called interior provinces. This was an unnecessary and inflammatory provocation to San Antonians of all ideologies. To Republicans, it looked like a clear denial of their rights of representation. To conservatives, it felt like poor recompense for the loyalty they continued to show the crown. Combine this with Governor Cordero's decision back in 1807 to downsize San Antonio's city council and circumscribe its responsibilities, a move that actually punished the conservatives who held more seats, and Spanish insensitivity continued to find ways to unite the famously fractious San Antonio factions. On September 16, 1810, el 16 de septiembre, that priest from Dolores who had ministered to the condemned French general, Father Miguel Hidalgo, finally set off the tinderbox of revolt when he raised his grito, a primal scream of defiance against centuries of perceived Spanish exploitation. Father Hidalgo, like Napoleon, quickly recognized that San Antonio was fertile ground for an independence movement and a critical supply point with the United States of the North. As such, he endorsed the plan of a retired San Antonio militia captain named Juan Bautista de las Casas to capture the town, raise the banner of revolt there, and use it to supply the heartland of Mexico in the battles to come with the Spanish army. On January 22, 1811, Captain de las Casas, with quiet support from the Veramendi, Navarro, and Ruiz Republican faction, arrested the new Texas governor Manuel Salcedo in front of his house. De las Casas and his conspirators declared themselves for Father Hidalgo and sent Salcedo and several of the regular Spanish army officers in chains to rebel-controlled Monclova. The rebellion, however, soon lost steam, and San Antonians began to second-guess Captain de las Casas. He hadn't been in San Antonio for long and lacked an appreciation for local political sensitivities. He began confiscating the property of known royalists, but eventually cast the net so wide as to threaten the families and associates of many of his original supporters. Further, it soon became apparent that Governor Salcedo was not without friends, locally and at the national level, and many began to fear the repercussions of allowing the Casas Revolt to continue. On March 2nd, just 5 weeks or so after the Casas Revolt began, 10 of San Antonio's leading men met at Juan Manuel Zambrano's ranch, located today in the River Road neighborhood off of Mulberry and 281. The group included not only the Zambrano brothers, Erasmo Seguin, and others like the Arrochas from the conservative Canary Islanders, but also seemed to have included Republicans like Veramendi, Navarro, and Ruiz, who had originally supported Captain de las Casas. Once they had all agreed on a plan, Seguin, as commander of the militia, coordinated with his men to turn on the rebel captain, which they did the next morning on March 3rd, after which it was now Captain de las Casas' turn to march to Monclova in chains. The uprising hadn't gone much better for Father Hidalgo than it had for Captain de las Casas. After marching his Army of the Americas to within striking distance of Mexico City, Father Hidalgo lost heart and decided not to attack, giving the Royalists time to regroup and turn the tables on him. Pretty soon, it was Father Hidalgo who was on the run, fleeing north back up into the Bajío and eventually Coahuila. Only his closest advisors knew his true destination. He was headed somewhere he might extend the Royalist supply lines and shorten his own, somewhere hostile to Spaniards, both physically and politically, and somewhere where the flame of revolt, or so he thought, still burned bright in the Casas Revolt. Father Hidalgo was headed to San Antonio. Only he chose his guide poorly. He hired that self-proclaimed Dutch Baron de Bastrop, who had come to San Antonio in 1803 following the Louisiana Purchase, and who knew the country well. But the Baron de Bastrop, an associate and business partner of many of the men back in San Antonio who were leading the counter-revolt against de las Casas, by this time probably knew that the Casas Revolt was doomed. He probably also knew the deposed Governor Salcedo as well, and that Salcedo's allies had recently managed to flip the man on whose ranch he was being held prisoner, one Colonel Ignacio Elizondo, who more than anything simply wanted to be on the winning side of this revolt. When Colonel Elizondo freed the deposed Governor Salcedo from his ranch near Monclova, Salcedo immediately set out to round up royalist forces, aware that Father Hidalgo and his Army of the Americas were nearby. The royalists set an ambush on the Camino Real just outside of Monclova, and on March 21st, 1811, barely 6 months after the father had raised his grito and less than 2 months after San Antonio had raised hers, Father Hidalgo was captured. Father Hidalgo would be executed in Chihuahua on July 30th, and Captain de las Casas the very next day. De las Casas' head would be salted and returned to San Antonio for display in the Plaza de Armas. As a reward for the town's loyalty to the king, the Villa de San Fernando, the principal town amongst San Antonio's communities, was elevated to the dignity of a ciudad, or city. Yet when Governor Salcedo returned to San Antonio on September 11th, he was not inclined to be so magnanimous. He pushed Zambrano's ruling junta aside and dismissed it as too soft, having focused on such trifles as funding perhaps the very first public school in northern New Spain. Salcedo had a score to settle, and he immediately began arresting suspected rebel sympathizers and confiscating their property. And some vecinos, he insisted, would pay the ultimate price, executing those whom he suspected of having rendered aid to Captain de las Casas. One of these unfortunates was José Félix Menchaca. His last name should tell you his lineage. On his father's side, he was descended from the great presidial commanders of the 18th century, a post that had been held by his father, great-uncle, and great-great-uncle, the San Antonio leather-stocking José de Urrutia. His wife descended from the first Canary Island settlers. He was a relative of nearly everyone in town, and he was not the only one to lose his life in Governor Salcedo's purges. It would be his death, and the deaths of so many others in town, that would radicalize the community. And it would be his son, José, and his nephew, Colonel Miguel Menchaca, who would pick up the fallen banner of Hidalgo. As before, the Spanish had taken a unique moment of potential unity and patriotism and squandered it through indifference and arrogance. Governor Salcedo's retributions would only remind San Antonians why they had revolted against him in the first place. And in the next episode, they will raise the cry of revolt once again. Thank you for listening. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher and subscribe and leave us a review, because if everyone who listened to this podcast left a review on iTunes or Stitcher, it would launch San Antonio's story to the top of the charts. For more information and old episodes, you can also visit our website at brandonseal.com. Editing for this episode was provided by my lovely wife and in-house copy editor, Susanna. Sound engineering was performed by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend, Noel McKay, for letting us use his song, Mi San Antonio, which you can find on iTunes as well. For this episode, I recommend going to La Villita, which was preserved in the 1930s and can give you some sense of what urban San Antonio in the 1800s might have felt like. There's some great restaurants there that are constantly overlooked by locals, and a visit to the Arts Village is as good of an excuse as any to walk around San Antonio's first hip cosmopolitan neighborhood.